For nearly 40 years, Warhammer 40,000 has been adding to its canon of incredible lore and stories. What started as a miniature war game has since evolved into a multimedia franchise with a massive universe containing its own history dating back to well beyond the days humans first walked the Earth. It can be a daunting task to make sense of 40k's dense lore, but this video will hopefully make it at least a little easier, because in this video, we will be going over the history of the 40k universe, from the first steps of humanity on Earth to the present era known as the Era Indomitus. It's worth noting that for this video, we will be focusing on the timeline of the human race. There are important events that precede the dawn of mankind, but the Imperium of Man is the dominant faction in the 40k universe, and grasping their timeline gives a strong picture of the overall setting. One more thing of note is that a few pieces of lore need to be elaborated on in order to make sense of the setting's timeline. When we detour into one of those pieces of lore, you will see its name appear in the top right corner. With introductions out of the way, let's not waste any more time and dive into the Warhammer 40,000 timeline. Spanning the first 15,000 millennia, the Age of Terra, also called the Age of Progress in older texts, covers humanity's rise from a pre-industrial Iron Age civilization to a spacefaring one. Over this vast stretch of time, countless human civilizations rose and fell on Earth, most of their histories now lost, but together they laid the foundation for humanity's eventual dominance of the planet and ultimately the stars. During Earth's medieval period, three powerful and malevolent entities were born in the Imperium. These chaos gods were fueled into existence by the collective experiences of conscious creatures. Khorne, the god of war and bloodshed, emerged from this era's relentless warfare. Tzeentch, the god of change and scheming, was shaped by the rise of complex nation-states and political ambition. Nurgle, the god of plague and decay, came into being through the suffering caused by waves of devastating disease. Each arose separately at different points across this period as the sum of human misery and conflict reached a threshold sufficient to birth a god. In the late 2nd and early 3rd millennia, humanity developed the technology to leave Earth and began colonizing the solar system. Mars was the first major destination, settled by industrial corporations who eventually terraformed it, reshaping its environment to support human life. Mars quickly became a hub of scientific and technical achievement, a reputation it would carry far into the future. Humanity also established settlements on the moons of Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune. Toward the end of the Age of Terra, bleeding into the next chapter of human history known as the Age of Technology, humanity mastered advanced fusion and antimatter propulsion, and as a result, designing ships capable of traveling between star systems became possible, and humanity began settling worlds beyond the solar system. Only nearby star systems could be reached initially, and the colonies planted there were completely independent by necessity, as a single journey could take up to 10 human generations. Almost nothing of this period survives as reliable history. To later scholars of the human empire, it exists only as myth and legend. One thing, however, is known. The Emperor, humanity's immortal guardian and future ruler, was alive and present on Earth throughout this entire era. Two origins for the Emperor exist. The first we will discuss is considered apocryphal due to not having been mentioned in source material for decades. For that information, you will see it marked in the top right corner of the screen. When that marking is not present, it is canon information, although it is worth noting that some Warhammer lore experts consider early accounts of the Emperor's life that come from the Emperor himself unreliable, due to his propensity to withhold information on his early life. The Emperor is not an ordinary human, but rather the combined reincarnation of all the shamans of prehistoric humanity, the earliest known humans with psychic ability, capable of perceiving and interacting with the immaterium. Long before the Emperor's birth, as human civilization grew and its collective emotions, fear, hatred, suffering, churned ever more turbulently in the immaterium, the shamans found themselves losing something vital. where once they could reincarnate into new bodies after death, the darkening spiritual landscape meant their souls were now being consumed by the predatory entities of the Imperium upon dying. It was only a matter of time before the shamans died out entirely, and with them, humanity's only psychic guardians against the corrupting influence of chaos. Fearing what would happen to their collective wisdom and power once the Chaos Gods fully formed and began preying on psychic souls, these shamans sacrificed themselves so that their essence could be reborn as a single immensely powerful being. Together as one, they took poison and died simultaneously. The torrent of psychic energy released by thousands of souls at once was too great for the Imperium's predators to consume, burning through them like a purifying fire. From that sacrifice, one soul was forged from many, and that soul was reborn as the Emperor. A year after the shaman's sacrifice, their merged soul was reborn as a child in a small farming and herding settlement in Neolithic Anatolia. He was born to ordinary parents, with ordinary siblings, indistinguishable in origin from anyone else in his community. But the sheer magnitude of the psychic power contained within him was so immense that it rewrote his very biology in the womb, rendering him immortal, no longer subject to death, reincarnation, or the soul-consuming dangers of the Imperium that had doomed the shamans before him. As he aged, his extraordinary psychic abilities would reveal themselves and increase in scale. For 38,000 years, the Emperor walked the earth, moving through human civilizations across the ages. At first, he was only a silent witness to humanity's victories and failures, but over time he began to quietly intervene, using his vast accumulated wisdom to help communities develop better governance, farming practices, animal husbandry, and technology, and to nudge humanity toward peace where he could. As the millennia passed, the Emperor took on countless identities across human history. Sometimes he stepped into the foreground, becoming a great leader, a religious figure, or even a messiah in times of crisis. At other times, he worked quietly in the background as an advisor to kings, a court magician, or a pioneering scientist. Some of the roles he played were humble and forgotten. Others shaped the course of history. However, despite the account just given, the truth is that the Emperor's early history is largely a mystery. What came before his emergence as a unifying force on Earth remains shrouded in legend. What is certain is that he is immortal and possesses psychic abilities of extraordinary magnitude. Everything else is, at best, incomplete. The Emperor of Mankind is an extraordinarily ancient being, potentially born as far back as 8000 BC. He is understood to be the collective reincarnation of all the shamans who guided early humanity in prehistoric times. As he aged across his countless lifetimes, his immense psychic powers grew stronger, and he gradually recovered the memories and knowledge of every one of his past lives. As a young adolescent, the Emperor's father was murdered by his own uncle. While preparing his father's body for burial, the Emperor received a psychic vision revealing exactly how the murder had occurred. He then calmly used his telekinetic abilities to stop his uncle's heart without anger or grief, simply as a matter of quiet resolve. By his own account, this was the moment the Emperor came to understand that humanity needed law, order, and wise leadership to reach its true potential. Shortly after, he left his village and traveled to what he called the first city of humanity, believed to be one of the ancient city-states in Mesopotamia. Regardless of the exact details of his origins, the Emperor was the most powerful psychic human who ever lived. He belonged to a rare category of immortal beings, and was alive during humanity's early golden age of interstellar civilization. During this time, he was known to associate with others of his kind. One such individual was a woman named Olivia Sureka. Together with Olivia and several other immortals, the future Emperor traveled on a voyage to a world called Molech. There, they found a gate leading into the realm of chaos, the domain of the Chaos Gods. The Emperor entered, and what happened inside remains a mystery. He either struck a bargain with the Chaos Gods or took something from them by force. Either way, he emerged with new powers and the knowledge needed to one day create the Primarchs, superhuman beings engineered through a combination of advanced genetic science and the supernatural energies of the warp. Before leaving Molech, the Emperor tasked Olivia with guarding the gate until the world could eventually be protected by the civilization he intended to build. The Chaos Gods, for their part, recognized the Emperor as the greatest threat to their existence in the entire galaxy and named him the Anathema. The Age of Technology was the peak of human scientific and technological achievement, lasting from roughly the 15th millennium to the 25th millennium, followed by a period of catastrophic collapse known as the Age of Strife. During and even before this era, humanity had spread far beyond Earth, colonizing worlds across the galaxy in a period of expansion known as the Stellar Exodus. A defining milestone of the Age of Technology was the development of the warp drive and the Gellar field around the 18th millennium. These technologies allowed human spacecraft to make faster-than-light journeys by passing through the warp. While this dramatically accelerated humanity's colonization of the galaxy and enabled trade and communication between distant worlds for the first time, warp travel remained extremely hazardous, with many ships never reaching their destinations. It was also during this period that humanity made its first contact with alien races. A second crucial development then occurred: the creation of the Navigator gene, which gave rise to a new breed of mildly psychic humans known as Navigators. Born capable of perceiving the currents of the warp, the Navigators could guide ships through it far more accurately and over a far greater distance than any computer could manage alone. Many scholars suspect the Emperor's involvement in the discovery, though its true origins are unknown. Navigator families grew from being tools of trade cartels into powerful, independent dynasties by the 19th millennium. A landmark invention of this era was the Standard Template Construct, or STC, a comprehensive computer database containing the whole of humanity's scientific and technological knowledge, along with instructions for building essentially anything a colony might need. The STC system allowed even the most remote and isolated settlements across the galaxy to maintain a high level of technology, and its development triggered an explosion of colonization that pushed humanity to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. For the remainder of the Age of Technology, humanity continued spreading across the stars, growing increasingly diverse and dispersed. Wars were fought, including against various alien races, some now long extinct, others still familiar to the 41st millennium, such as the Eldari and the Orcs, but none seriously threatened the stability of human space. The wealth and knowledge gained through exploration also bred a growing arrogance, and science itself came to replace religion as humanity's highest devotion. Following the development of warp drive travel, humanity's scattered colonies were brought together with Earth under some form of federated interstellar government, keeping the human species politically unified and powerful. The exact nature and structure of this government has been lost to history. Toward the end of the 22nd millennium, psychically gifted humans began appearing across nearly every human world in a relatively short period of time. On more advanced worlds, they were protected by law and permitted to develop their abilities, while on less enlightened worlds, they were hunted down and killed. How these early psychers managed to avoid the ever-present danger of demonic possession for thousands of years remains unexplained. Contributing greatly to humanity's success in colonizing the galaxy during this period were the Men of Iron, self-aware humanoid robots developed by an earlier faction of humanity known as the Men of Stone, who had themselves been engineered specifically for rapid interstellar settlement. According to fragmentary legends and surviving records, the Men of Stone were an artificially created or genetically engineered faction of humanity, themselves created by an even more mysterious group known as the Men of Gold. They were brought into being sometime during the 21st millennium, built to help humanity explore and colonize the furthest reaches of the galaxy. Their emergence coincided with the gradual decline and eventual disappearance of the Men of Gold from the historical record. According to legend, the Men of Stone existed in a state of only half-life, which made them far less vulnerable to the corrupting influence of the warp and the threat of demonic possession, making faster-than-light travel significantly safer for them than for ordinary humans. The Men of Gold were a group who appeared during humanity's earliest era, when the powerful and immortal psychic figure known as the Emperor was secretly watching over and guiding the development of the human race. The Men of Gold joined him in this effort, though details about who or what they were are scarce, known only through ancient, incomplete records. The Men of Gold spread across Earth, building civilizations and bringing order to the world. Physically and emotionally superior to ordinary humans, they also engineered the Men of Stone to explore and colonize the galaxy. However, as the Men of Stone rose to prominence and overshadowed the Men of Gold, what ultimately became of them is a mystery. The Men of Iron were humanoid, artificially intelligent machines. For centuries, the Men of Iron served humanity loyally as both a military force and a labor workforce. Though they were built to serve and had won many wars on humanity's behalf, the Men of Iron eventually turned on their creators for reasons unknown. Near the end of this era of technological advancement, they launched a devastating war against humanity across its many worlds. During this conflict, known as the Cybernetic Revolt, both sides deployed terrifyingly advanced weapons. Among the most devastating were the Mechanivores, colossal thinking machines capable of tearing apart entire continents, splitting planets open to their cores, and even absorbing the fabric of space and time itself as a form of data. Another weapon unleashed during this war was the Sun Snuffer, machines that would uncoil in space into structures larger than Saturn's rings, designed to consume entire stars. Perhaps the most widespread and feared weapons of the war were the Omniphages, swarms of intelligent microscopic machines that could strip an entire planet's surface bare in just a matter of hours. Humanity ultimately won the Cybernetic Revolt, but the cost was staggering. The war shattered humanity's economic strength and political unity, laying the groundwork for an even greater collapse. The trauma of this conflict left a permanent mark on human culture. The development of truly thinking machines became one of the most serious crimes across human space. In the aftermath, rather than risk another rebellion, humanity began creating servitors, a topic to be covered later. At the close of this golden age, humanity faced a new crisis. Warp travel became increasingly unreliable and eventually impossible. This was caused by massive violent storms erupting within that dimension, which were early signs of a cataclysmic event still to come, the birth of a new god of chaos and the destruction of an ancient alien civilization. Already weakened by the wars against the Men of Iron, humanity's interstellar civilization crumbled as trade and communication between colonies collapsed, leaving worlds isolated and cut off from one another. Heavily populated worlds like Earth, which depended on interstellar trade to feed their people, were suddenly cut off and unable to sustain themselves. Famine spread rapidly. At the same time, the dimensional storms tearing through the parallel dimension caused widespread demonic possession and mass insanity, particularly among psychically gifted humans, pushing already struggling societies into chaos and violence. Most human civilizations collapsed into barbarism. The 5,000 years that followed are known as the Age of Strife. The Age of Strife, also called Old Night, was a catastrophic period of human history lasting roughly from the 25th to the 30th millennium. The precise details and dates of the Age of Strife are largely unknown. Some records were simply lost to time and the era's chaos, but imperial authorities have also deliberately suppressed information about this period. Throughout the first half of the Age of Strife, power over the solar system shifted back and forth between Earth and Mars. By the 28th millennium, nearly all traces of advanced civilization on Earth had vanished, replaced by warring techno-barbarian factions fighting over the remnants of humanity's once great society. Mars followed a very different path. After a brief period of chaos that left its once carefully cultivated ecosystem in ruins, a faction of technology-worshipping priests, the Tech Priests, defeated the psychically gifted mutants and rogue artificial intelligences that had overrun the planet. They gradually unified Mars under a theocratic rule centered on the worship of a deity known as the Machine God. When the Tech Priests visited Earth, they found only ruin and anarchy, and deemed it unworthy of saving. Turning their attention elsewhere, they spent many generations studying the dimensional storms, eventually learning to detect brief windows of calm within them. During this time, they also developed massive robotic war machines known as Titans to defend their world. As human civilization collapsed around the galaxy, countless alien species seized the opportunity to strike back against humanity or simply to plunder and enslave now defenseless worlds. Hundreds of human settlements were attacked, their populations slaughtered, mutilated, or taken captive. Those who survived the onslaught were stripped of their civilization, knowledge, and culture, forced to abandon everything in the desperate struggle simply to survive. As humanity suffered under the chaos of the Age of Strife, the being who would become the Emperor of Mankind concluded that he could no longer guide humanity from the shadows. He would need to step forward and take a more direct, active role in human affairs. With the help of his close friend and collaborator Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor launched a series of military campaigns against the other warlords on Earth, conflicts that would later be collectively known as the Unification Wars. During these campaigns, the Emperor fielded several military forces made up of genetically enhanced soldiers to give himself every tactical advantage. The most powerful of these were known as the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors, also called the Thunder Legion or Thunder Regiments, were 20 regiments of superhuman soldiers created by the Emperor through genetic engineering, chemical augmentation, and muscle grafting techniques. They were the first such warriors he ever created and served as the predecessors to what would eventually become the Space Marines. The Thunder Warriors were organized into 20 legions, each led by a commander bearing the title of Primarch. Unlike the Primarchs who would later lead the Space Marines, these Thunder Warrior Primarchs were not physically or mentally superior to the soldiers they commanded. They were simply the most skilled fighters and tacticians among their peers, chosen by the Emperor for their battlefield prowess and leadership ability. Each Thunder Warrior Legion appears to have been built around a specific battlefield role or specialty, mirroring the structure of the Space Marine legions that would come later. For example, the 4th Legion of the Thunder Warriors, known as the Iron Lords, specialized in siege warfare, just as the 4th Legion of the Space Marines, the Iron Warriors, would later do. The Thunder Warriors were enormous super soldiers, larger and more physically imposing than even most Space Marines, and capable of holding their own against one in combat. They were also built with a strong resistance to psychic attacks, likely because they frequently faced chaos-corrupted enemies who wielded sorcery during the Unification Wars. Any psychic attempting to assault a Thunder Warrior mentally would instead find themselves suffering severe pain from the attempt. Thunder Warriors possessed extraordinary upper body strength that surpassed even that of the Emperor's other genetically enhanced soldiers. Combined with their early suits of power armor, this made them nearly unstoppable in close quarters combat. Their skeletal structure was reinforced beyond that of a Space Marine, and their reflexes were significantly enhanced as well. The Thunder Warriors were far from flawless, however. Some suffered from mental instability, while others would unexpectedly succumb to catastrophic biological breakdown after several years, their own enhanced bodies ultimately failing them. Beyond their physical flaws, the Thunder Warriors were cold-blooded and ruthless, thriving on the violence and power of combat with no purpose or talent beyond war. It is also worth taking a closer look at the Emperor's friend and advisor, Malcador. Malcador the Sigillite, also honored with the title Malcador the Hero by the Emperor himself, was a powerful psychic and scholar who served as the Emperor's regent, governing in his name whenever the Emperor was away from Earth or otherwise occupied. His title, Sigillite, means seal bearer in an ancient Earth language, reflecting the immense trust the Emperor places in him, as Malcador was empowered to speak and act with the Emperor's full authority in his absence. Malcador was an extraordinarily powerful psychic, perhaps the second most powerful human who has ever lived, surpassed only by the Emperor himself. Despite the strength of his armies and allies, the Emperor's greatest asset was his intellect. His rationality, foresight, and unparalleled mastery of science were matched only by his formidable power as a warrior, and even then few understood the true extent of his abilities. He conquered vast stretches of Earth, destroying those who refused to join him, but his campaign was driven by more than normal ambition. Wherever he established his rule, he tore down superstitious and blind faith, replacing it with order and reason. A unified Earth was only the beginning. The Emperor intended to use it as a launching point for the reconquest of the entire galaxy, building an Imperium of man founded on the principles of progress and reason, a set of ideas known as the Imperial Truth. The Imperial Truth was the Emperor's official ideology, atheistic, rationalist, and materialist in nature. It was built on reason, scientific method, and secular progress, intended to replace religions and superstitions that had long shaped human civilization. The Imperial Truth did not deny the existence of other dimensions, alien species, or psychic powers. It simply rejected the idea that any of those things were supernatural. What some might call sorcery or attribute to gods were, in the Emperor's view, simply phenomena that science had not yet fully explained. The war raged on until every last faction, nation, and city-state on Earth had sworn loyalty to the Emperor, unifying the planet for the first time in thousands of years. And even before the fighting was fully over, he and the brilliant minds he had gathered around him had already begun experimenting with genetics. This genetic work served two purposes. First, it aimed to restore Earth's population, undoing generations of damage caused by radiation, viral weapons, and chemical warfare that had ravaged the planet. Second, it continued and advanced the work begun with the Thunder Warriors, pushing the development of genetically enhanced superhuman soldiers even further, a program that would ultimately give rise to what would become the Space Marine Legions. With the Unification Wars concluded in 29/712, the Emperor established a unified government over Earth and then turned his attention to Mars. There he struck a deal with the tech priests of the cult Mechanicus, in exchange for access to their vast factories, their armies, their towering war machines known as Titans, and their orbital shipyards, all of which he would need for his planned reconquest of the galaxy. The Emperor granted Mars and its affiliated worlds complete political independence and exempted them from the atheism required by his Imperial Truth. This agreement, known as the Treaty of Mars, marked the true birth of the Imperium of Man, founded on the alliance between Earth and Mars. Before continuing, it's worth giving a brief overview of the Adeptus Mechanicus, as they will come up multiple times across the timeline. The Adeptus Mechanicus is the official name within the Imperium for the Mars-based Cult of the Machine, which supplies the Imperium with its scientists, engineers, and technicians. Its tech priests form a privileged caste who preciously guard the knowledge needed to maintain and build the Imperium's advanced technology, considering such wisdom sacred. Rather than following the religious faith practiced by most of the Imperium, the Adeptus Mechanicus follows its own doctrine, worshipping a deity they call the Machine God, or the Omnissiah. Central to this faith is the belief that knowledge itself is the purest expression of divinity, making any creature or object that embodies knowledge sacred. The Emperor holds the highest place of this worship, as the Mechanicus believes he is the living embodiment of the Machine God on Earth. With the Unification Wars behind him and the title of Emperor claimed, the Emperor of Mankind recognized that reuniting all of humanity would require more than his efforts alone. He would need commanders he could trust absolutely, with abilities approaching his own. He ordered the creation of 20 extraordinarily advanced genetically engineered beings known as the Primarchs, each built upon the Emperor's own genetic code as a foundation and intended to lead humanity's reunification across the galaxy. The gods of chaos, however, feared what the Emperor's plans would mean for their own power. Somehow bypassing the mystical defenses protecting the Emperor's secret laboratory beneath the Himalayan mountains, they seized the Primarchs while still in their gestation capsules and scattered them across the galaxy to various human-settled worlds. In the process, several were subtly tainted by chaos, a corruption that would lie dormant and grow over time. Faced with this setback, the Emperor adapted his approach without abandoning his ultimate goal. Using the remaining genetic material from the Primarch project, he cultivated thousands of sets of gene seed, the biological foundation that would be used to create a new generation of superhuman warriors. A gene seed is the collective term for the engineered biological material implanted into adolescent human males to transform them into Space Marines. It contains all the genetic information needed to reshape an ordinary human body, working through engineered biological mechanisms that rebuild the recipient according to the biological template the Emperor originally designed, either growing the necessary organs outside the body for implantation or triggering their development directly within the recipient. Each set of gene seed would develop into 19 distinct organs that, when implanted into a young human male, would transform him into one of the transhuman warriors known as the Astartes, the Space Marines. Using these gene seeds derived from each of the 20 Primarchs, the Emperor raised 20 legions of Space Marines from the population of newly unified Earth. Conveniently, after 5,000 years, the devastating dimensional storms that had cut humanity off from the rest of the galaxy finally subsided. With interstellar travel possible once more, the Emperor wasted no time launching his campaign to reunite humanity across the galaxy, an undertaking that would become known as the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade was the largest and most ambitious military undertaking in human history. Despite the vast fleets and war materials that Mars could produce, the expansion across the galaxy was slow, primarily due to a shortage of manpower and capable leadership. Without the Primarch's unique genetic material, creating new Space Marines took far longer than was ideal. However, not long after the Great Crusade began, the Emperor was reunited with the first of his lost Primarchs when his fleet reached the nearby mining world of Chthoniya, where he found Horus, the man who would go on to become the War Master, supreme commander of the Imperial armies. Over the course of the Great Crusade, all of the Primarchs were eventually rediscovered by the Emperor's fleets, and each was given command of the Space Marine Legion whose gene seed had been built from their DNA. Before continuing, we will give a brief overview of the Primarchs. Two of them, the Primarchs of the 2nd and the 11th Legions, have been deliberately erased from Imperial records. Their identities, homeworld, and legions are unknown. The reason for this is a great secret and mystery. The rest are as follows. Lionel Johnson was raised on the death world of Caliban and led the Dark Angels. Secretive and emotionally distant, he was nonetheless a brilliant strategist and gifted duelist with an intense sense of loyalty. Fulgrim was raised on Chemos and led the Emperor's children, and was driven by an obsession with perfection and beauty, fulfilling his pride and vanity. Perturabo was raised on Olympia and led the Iron Warriors. A master of siege warfare with a brilliant analytical mind, he was defined by bitterness and a deep resentment at being undervalued. Jagatai Khan was raised on Chagoris and led the White Scars. Independent and philosophical, he favored fast, devastating strikes over rigid military structure. Leman Russ was raised on the harsh world of Fenris and led the Space Worlds. Savage yet cunning, he served as the Emperor's executioner and carried the image of a mythic warrior king. Rogel Dorn was raised on Inuit and led the Imperial Fists. Stoic and disciplined and unwaveringly loyal, he was a master of fortification and defense. Conrad Kurz was raised on Nostromo and led the Night Lords. Haunted by prophetic visions, he ruled through terror and was consumed by a dark obsession with punishment and fear. Sanguinius was raised on Bal Secundus and led the Blood Angels. Noble, compassionate, and charismatic, he possessed an angelic appearance and prophetic gifts and visions. Ferrus Manus was raised on Medusa and led the Iron Hands. Defined by immense physical strength, blunt directness, and exceptional craftsmanship, he believed in strength and endurance above all else. Angron was raised on Nuceria and led the World Eaters. A former gladiatorial slave, he was a being capable of deep empathy, but also capable of being consumed entirely by rage. Robute Guilliman was raised on Macragge and led the Ultramarines. A gifted statesman and administrator as much as a warrior, he was defined by his rational empire-building mind. Mortarion was raised on Barbarus and led the Death Guard. Grim and enduring, he harbored a deep hatred of tyrants and a resentment born of hardship. Magnus the Red was raised on Prospero and led the Thousand Sons. He was an extraordinarily powerful psychic and was deeply scholarly, traits matched only by his arrogance. Horus was raised on Chthoniya and led the Luna Wolves, the most charismatic and politically gifted of his brothers and the Emperor's most trusted son. He would become first among equals amongst the Primarchs. Lorgar was raised on Colchis and led the Word Bearers, and was a deeply religious visionary figure, much to the Emperor's chagrin. Vulcan was raised on Nocturne and led the Salamanders. Compassionate, resilient, and a masterful smith, he was defined by his extraordinary care for ordinary people and civilians. Corvus Corax was raised on Lycaeus and led the Raven Guard. A master of shadow warfare, he was defined by melancholy and introspection. Alpharius led the Alpha Legion alongside his twin Omegon. The two brothers were so alike that they were often indistinguishable, and together they embodied misdirection and hidden agendas. The Great Crusade would eventually culminate in the Ullanor Crusade, a massive imperial assault on an orc empire ruled by the overlord Urlach Uruk, representing the peak of the Imperium's expansion. The scale of the operation was staggering: 100,000 space marines, 8 million regular soldiers, and thousands of starships and their crews were deployed for the campaign. Following the victory of the Imperium, under the Emperor's decree, Ullanor was transformed into a trophy world, officially designated Mundus Tropeum on all Imperial maps and records. It was to stand as a monument not just to the single victory, but as a symbol of the Great Crusade and humanity's conquests as a whole. After more than 2 centuries of relentless warfare, over 2 million human-settled worlds had been reclaimed for the Imperium by the early 31st millennium. Throughout much of this campaign, the Primarch Horus had fought at the Emperor's side as his closest son and primary military commander, and the two had forged a deep bond. But with the Great Crusade nearing its peak, the Emperor now needed to consolidate his newly built Imperium and turn his attention to the next stage of his larger plan. At a gathering following the Ullanor Crusade, the Emperor made 2 announcements that stunned those present. First, he named Horus as War Master, supreme commander of all Imperial military forces, including the other Space Marine legions, in order to lead the final years of the Great Crusade in the Emperor's stead. Second, the Emperor declared his intention to return to Earth to pursue a secret project he believed would benefit all of humanity. The Emperor's secret project was to use an ancient device called the Golden Throne, a powerful psychic amplification tool predating the Age of Strife, unearthed on Terra, to break open the webway for humanity's use, which would allow near instantaneous travel between any connected points. Granting humanity access to the webway would eliminate the need for conventional starship travel and end humanity's dangerous dependence on psychically gifted navigators and communicators. The Emperor intended this to be his greatest gift to humanity. the foundation for an era of peace and progress once the Great Crusade was finished. However, the Emperor kept this plan a secret from the Primarchs, and the announcement provoked considerable shock and anger among them. Many could not understand why the Emperor was abandoning the fight, or why Horus had been elevated above his brothers. While some Primarchs, such as Rogaldorn, Sanguinius, and Fulgrim, were genuinely pleased for Horus, the others reacted with varying degrees of resentment and disapproval. Tensions worsened when the Emperor announced he would be creating a civilian governing body called the Council of Terra, made up of bureaucrats and nobles, to handle the day-to-day running of the Imperium while he was occupied with his secret project. Among the Council's responsibilities would be administering the Imperial Tithe, a galaxy-wide system of resource and manpower contributions owed to the Imperium. Malkador the Sigillite was named the Council's first Lord and Regent of Terra, tasked with leading it in the Emperor's absence. The announcement that the Primarchs would be confined to purely military roles, subject to civilian administrators who had never fought for the Imperium, deeply unsettled many of them, including Horus. They felt entitled to political power after everything they had sacrificed. However, the Emperor had deliberately chosen to place governance in the hands of ordinary humans because he wanted humanity to learn to rule itself rather than become permanently dependent on a superhuman ruling class. Although this would all lead to the eventual downfall of Horus and the Imperium, the seeds of betrayal had already been sown before Horus's own corruption. Lorgar, Primarch of the Word Bearers, hailed from Colchis, a world steeped in religious fanaticism, and he had long worshipped the Emperor as a living god, spreading that devotion to every world his legion conquered. The Emperor, however, despised organized religion, holding it responsible for much of humanity's suffering throughout history. He publicly rejected his own divinity and forbade religious worship across the Imperium, demanding his subjects embrace the imperial truth that reason, science, and logic alone were the path to a better future. Lorgar took this rejection from his father poorly. Hurt and embittered that the Emperor refused his devotion, he turned instead to the gods of chaos, who were more than willing to receive the worship of a Primarch. The Word-Bearer's legion was gradually corrupted, and Lorgar, along with his lieutenant Erebus, was given a task by the Chaos Gods to corrupt their fellow Space Marines, beginning with the most important target of all, the War Master Horus. Taking command of the Great Crusade as War Master, Horus threw himself into his new responsibilities with genuine dedication. However, beneath the surface, significant tension and dissension were brewing. Only a handful of Primarchs stood reliably by Horus during this turbulent period, among them the scheming Lorgar. Horus himself grew increasingly frustrated as he disagreed with many of the Council of Terra's new policies, which placed heavy burdens of taxation and administration on newly conquered worlds. Deeper still, he began to feel that he was failing his father, and was wounded that the Emperor had confided in none of his sons about the true nature of the secret project that had drawn him back to Earth. These feelings of bitterness, resentment, and abandonment festered, and would soon have catastrophic consequences. During a battle on the moon of a world named Davin, Horus faced a former Imperial governor named Eugen Temba, who Horus himself had left in charge of the planet 60 years earlier. In the intervening decades, Temba had fallen to the worship of the chaos god Nurgle and had been transformed into a bloated mutant, slaughtering his own garrison and raising them as undead plague zombies. This had all been orchestrated behind the scenes by Erebus, who had previously stolen an alien blade sacred to Nurgle from a human civilization called the Interrex and delivered it to Temba as a weapon. During his personal confrontation with Temba, Horus was wounded by this blade, leaving him with a toxic, festering wound that none of his legion's medical specialists could heal. Seizing his opportunity, Erebus persuaded the Luna Wolves' internal brotherhood to allow a group of Davinite shamans, who were secretly chaos cultists, to treat the dying War Master. Desperate and grief-stricken at the prospect of losing their Primarch, the Luna Wolves agreed, despite the fact that doing so directly violated the Emperor's imperial truth. During the dark rituals inside the temple, Horus's spirit was drawn out of his body and into the warp. There he was shown a terrifying vision of the future, the Imperium transformed into a brutal, repressive theocracy, where the Emperor and several of his Primarchs were worshipped as gods by the masses. But Horus was nowhere among them. Magnus the Red, the psychically gifted Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had also entered the warp through sorcery in an attempt to save Horus from corruption. He warned Horus that the vision was only one of many possible futures, and one that Horus himself had the power to prevent. But Horus, already consumed by resentment toward the Emperor, was all too willing to believe what he had seen. The Chaos Gods offered Horus a simple bargain: deliver the Emperor and the galaxy would be his. Driven by jealousy, wounded pride, and a sense of abandonment, Horus accepted. His wound was healed, and he was filled with the power of the Chaos Gods. Renouncing his loyalty to the Emperor, he renamed his legion, the Sons of Horus, and turned them to the worship of Chaos. He then set about drawing his fellow Primarchs into rebellion, successfully corrupting Angron of the World Eaters, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and Mortarion of the Death Guard. Numerous regiments of the regular Imperial military and several Titan legions of the Adeptus Mechanicus also turned traitor alongside them. Magnus the Red, having foreseen Horus's betrayal through sorcery, a practice that had been forbidden to all Space Marines and Primarchs, attempted to warn the Emperor. To do so, Magnus used the same forbidden sorcery to send his message to Earth. The message broke through, but in doing so, it shattered all the psychic defenses the Emperor had placed around the Imperial Palace, including the protections over his secret webway project. Rather than believing the warning about Horus, the Emperor mistakenly concluded that Magnus himself was the traitor. This suspicion was fueled by the Thousand Suns Legion's own long history of uncontrolled mutations, a consequence of instability in Magnus's own genetic code, and their constant use of sorcery, which brought them into dangerous contact with the entities of the Imperium. The Emperor ordered Leman Russ, Magnus's greatest rival, to take the Space Wolves Legion and a force of psychic nullifying warriors known as the Sisters of Silence to bring Magnus back to Earth to stand trial. En route, Horus, already in open rebellion, convinced Leman, who had always distrusted Magnus's reliance on psychic powers, to launch a full military assault on Magnus's homeworld rather than simply arrest him. This was despite the fact that Magnus, upon realizing he had been manipulated by entities from the Imperium, had already accepted his guilt and was willing to face the Emperor's judgment. The devastating assault on his homeworld of Prospero would ultimately drive Magnus into the arms of Chaos, convinced that his father had betrayed him. Though the four original legions that were under Horus's command, those being the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's Children, had all turned traitor, roughly a third of each legion still contained loyal warriors. Many of these were Space Marines who had been recruited personally by the Emperor on Earth before the Great Crusade began. To deal with this problem, Horus gathered his forces in the Istvan system, under the pretense of suppressing a rebellion against Imperial rule on the world of Istvan III. After opening the confrontation with a bombardment, Horus sent the known loyal Astartes to the planet, claiming they were there to restore it to the Imperium. Once they captured Coral City, the planet's capital, Horus betrayed them by ordering his fleet to launch virus bombs onto the planet. 8 billion civilians died almost instantly as the flesh-dissolving virus carried by the bombs swept across the planet, killing everything it touched. However, when Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, realized that some loyalists had survived, he flew into a rage and hurled 50 companies of his warriors at the planet without any tactical planning, descending into pure, frenzied slaughter. Horus was furious at the disruption to his plans, but chose to turn the situation to his advantage, reinforcing Angron with troops drawn from the other 3 legions. After 3 months of brutal fighting, the surviving loyalists were whittled down to just a few hundred warriors. Growing impatient, Horus finally ordered his forces to withdraw and then had the planet bombarded from orbit until nothing remained. The slaughter at Istvan III, known as the Isstvan III Atrocity, marked the first open act of Horus's rebellion, and with it, the true beginning of the Horus Heresy. 70 loyal Death Guard warriors, along with a figure known as the Imperial Saint Euphrates Keeler, had managed to commandeer a small warship called the Eisenstein under the command of Battle Captain Garo and fled the Isstvan system to warn the Emperor. The escape was harrowing. The ship was badly damaged by a traitor vessel, and while passing through the warp, it was boarded by undead servants of Nurgle, including the first known Plague Marines. The assault forced the ship to crash out of the warp early, killing all of its psychic navigational specialists and mortally wounding its sole navigator. Stranded and desperate, Garo drew attention to their location by ejecting the ship's warp drives and setting them to self-destruct. The explosion was detected by the navigators aboard the Phalanx, the enormous mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists Legion under Primarch Rogel Dorn, which had itself been stranded nearby due to the growing power of chaos disrupting travel through the warp. Dorn investigated, discovered the ship and its surviving crew, and Garo told him everything which had occurred on Isstvan III. Though initially reluctant to believe it, Dorn was ultimately convinced by Garo's testimony and evidence provided by a journalist named Mersadi Olatin, who had escaped from Horus's own flagship. In response, the Phalanx immediately set course for Earth. Once the news of the Isstvan III atrocity reached Malkador and the Emperor on Earth, the Emperor tasked Dorn with developing a plan to counter Horus's rebellion and the traitor forces aligned with him. Acting under the Emperor's authority, Dorn ordered the combined forces of 7 Space Marine legions to assault Horus and his traitor forces in the Isstvan system. However, during an assault on the planet Isstvan V, 3 loyalist legions, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, were catastrophically betrayed. The 4 legions meant to support them in a second assault wave, the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and a large contingent of the Word Bearers, had already secretly turned traitor. As the 3 loyalist legions fell back towards what they believed were friendly lines, the hidden traitors opened fire, catching them in a deadly crossfire between 2 hostile forces. The resulting slaughter nearly destroyed all 3 legions entirely, and the devastated survivors became known thereafter as the Shattered Legions. The betrayal broke what the Loyalists had believed was their numerical advantage, opening the way for Horus and his forces to march on Terra. Only a handful of Loyalist Space Marines escaped Isstvan V alive to bring news of the 4 additional traitor legions back to the Emperor. Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, was among the missing and was presumed dead for many months, though he would eventually make his own harrowing way back to Earth and resume command of his legion. Among the tragedies of Isstvan V was the death of Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, at the hands of his former close friend Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Corrupted by chaos and wielding a blade possessed by a demonic entity, Fulgrim beheaded Ferrus Manus, making him the first Primarch to fall in battle during the Horus Heresy. The events of Isstvan V became known as the Drop Site Massacre. In its aftermath, it was now known that half of all Space Marine legions had turned traitor. Over the following 9 years, the traitor fleets swept across the galaxy, unleashing a brutal civil war on worlds they had once helped bring into the Imperium. Guided by the Chaos Gods, the traitor forces abandoned all restraint. A common tactic was to simply bombard a single world with nuclear weapons from orbit, forcing the surrender of entire star systems through sheer terror. Genocide and casual brutality became routine as the traitors fell ever deeper under the influence of chaos. Worlds that were spared destruction faced an arguably worse fate of occupation by chaos-corrupted forces who inflicted horrific suffering on captive populations. Ironically, this reign of terror had an unintended consequence for the Emperor's own ideology. As countless people prayed to the Emperor for deliverance, a religious movement which held that the Emperor was a living god began to grow across the Imperium, directly contradicting the Emperor's own imperial truth. Even before his rebellion began in earnest, Horus knew he would need the support of the Adeptus Mechanicus and their advanced technology to have any hope of defeating the Emperor. He secured the loyalty of many of their tech priests by promising them access to lost ancient technological blueprints of the standard template construct. The heresy, splitting the Adeptus Mechanicus, would inevitably tear apart Mars. The planet was already rife with tension, as the various factions of the Adeptus Mechanicus were regularly engaged in espionage and sporadic violence against one another. Horus, in this fractured environment, sent his representative Regulus to Mars to win over the Fabricator General, the planet's supreme ruler, Kelbor Hall. Regulus persuaded him that Horus would grant the Mechanicus far greater autonomy than the Emperor ever had. As a gesture of goodwill, Horus provided information that allowed Kelbor Hall to unseal a repository of forbidden technology called the Vaults of Moravec, locked for 1,000 years by the Emperor's own decree because it contained artifacts corrupted by chaos. And thus the deal was struck, and the Fabricator General committed Mars and its resources to Horus's cause. The consequences of this deal were catastrophic. Opening the vaults unleashed chaos-corrupted computer code known as scrap code that spread like a virus through the interconnected computer networks of the Adeptus Mechanicus, causing widespread destruction and system failures across Mars. The Fabricator General and his allies, who became known as the Dark Mechanicum, exploited the chaos this caused to seize control of the planet, destroying or disabling many of the forces that remained loyal to the Emperor. The night the corrupted code was released became known, in Mechanicus legend, as the Death of Innocence. Full-scale civil war erupted on Mars in the aftermath, a conflict that became known as the Schism of Mars, mirroring the larger war consuming the Imperium. The ultimate objective of Horus and his traitor forces was the conquest of Earth, the heart of the Imperium. By taking it, Horus could fulfill his bargain with the Chaos Gods and destroy the Emperor. A decade after the start of the heresy, the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, and elements of the Word Bearers gathered at Mars in preparation for this final assault. The remainder of the Word Bearers Legion was dispatched on a separate mission to destroy the Ultramarines and their Primarch Guilliman on the world of Kolth, on the far side of the galaxy, ensuring that they would not come to the Emperor's aid. Rogel Dorn and Malkador the Sigillite back on Earth recalled all Loyalist forces to Terra to prepare for Horus's inevitable assault. However, due to Horus's careful planning and a variety of other circumstances, only 2 of the 9 remaining Loyalist Space Marine legions, the White Scars and the Blood Angels, managed to reach Earth before the traitor forces arrived. Alongside Dorn's Imperial Fists, 3 Titan legions and nearly 2 million regular soldiers stood ready to defend humanity in a battle that would determine the fate of the entire human race for the next 10,000 years. Though the Loyalist fleets and the massive defensive installations on Earth's moon fought back fiercely, destroying more than a quarter of the traitor fleet, they were vastly outnumbered and ultimately overwhelmed. The battle in space lasted 30 days, during which Horus's forces broke through the Imperial blockade, destroyed Earth's orbital platforms, and demolished the lunar defenses. After days of orbital bombardment, the traitor legions landed on Earth's surface and advanced on the 2 spaceports closest to the Imperial Palace, seizing them to prepare for the main landing of their forces. Despite fierce resistance from the Loyalists, both spaceports fell within hours. As the battle raged, Chaos cultists and traitor soldiers performed dark rituals and blood sacrifices across Earth's surface, weakening the boundary between the physical world and the Immaterium. This tore open rifts through which the most powerful demonic entities of Chaos were able to cross directly into the physical world. Despite many traitor landing craft being shot down before they reached the ground, enough survived to deliver waves of soldiers, tanks, and towering war machines to reinforce the besieging forces. The traitor forces pushed the defenders back to the walls of the Imperial Palace itself. The siege then began in earnest. 3 times the traitors scaled the palace walls, and 3 times they were thrown back by Sanguinius and his Blood Angels. Beyond the walls, the White Scars and their Primarch led forces in an attempt to draw the bulk of the besieging army away from the palace, but without success. As the outnumbered defenders were pushed back into the palace's interior, Horus grew frustrated with the slow pace of the assault. He ordered a traitor Titan legion, known as the Legio Mortis, to demolish sections of the palace walls. Despite taking heavy losses, the Titans tore open breaches in the defenses and the traitor forces poured through. Inside the palace, the defenders had been pushed back to the Eternity Gate, the last entrance into the palace's inner sanctum. The siege had lasted 55 days, and both sides knew the Imperium was on the verge of defeat. Then Erebus, first chaplain of the Wordbearers, brought Horus grave news. Their demonic allies had warned them that the Dark Angels and Space Wolves legions were closing in on Earth, with the Ultramarines not far behind. Facing the arrival of Loyalist reinforcements, Horus made a bold move, lowering the defensive shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, as a direct challenge to the Emperor. Loyalist ships in orbit detected this and relayed the information to the Imperial Palace. The Emperor accepted the challenge. Leading his elite personal guard, the Adeptus Custodes, alongside Primarchs Sanguinius and Rogaldorn, and veteran companies of Imperial Fists and Blood Angels, he teleported directly aboard Horus's flagship. As the Emperor's forces materialized aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus used his chaos-fueled powers to scatter them across the massive warship. Separated from one another, each group fought its way through the corrupted vessel's chaos-tainted defenders, struggling to regroup and reach Horus. Sanguinius was the first to reach Horus. In a final attempt at corruption, Horus tried to turn his oldest and closest friend among the Primarchs to the service of chaos. When Sanguinius refused, Horus attacked. Already badly wounded from the brutal fighting on Earth and a previous battle with a powerful demonic entity, Sanguinius was no match for Horus at the height of his chaos-empowered strength. When the Emperor finally fought his way to Horus's throne room, he found the winged body of Sanguinius lying dead at his son's feet. The Emperor and Horus then clashed in a battle that was both physical and psychic in nature. Eventually, the Emperor gained the upper hand, driving a blast of pure psychic energy through Horus's defenses and tearing his body apart. Then, summoning the last of his strength, the Emperor destroyed Horus utterly, burning his very soul out of existence so that the Chaos Gods could not resurrect him as a demonic servant. The destruction of Horus's soul sent a psychic shockwave rippling across the solar system. Demons were hurled back into the Imperium, and the traitor forces on Earth were thrown into mass panic within moments as the Chaos Gods found their power temporarily disrupted by the death of their greatest mortal champion. The panic among the traitor forces quickly collapsed into a full rout. Thousands of traitor Space Marines and Titans were cut down as they attempted to flee. The surviving traitor forces scrambled back to their landing craft and abandoned Earth. Back aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Rogaldorn finally fought his way to the bridge, where he made a devastating discovery, finding the body of his fallen brother Sanguinius and the Emperor himself, mortally wounded and barely clinging to life, his psychic strength spent in the battle against Horus. Back on Earth, Malkador had been sitting upon the Golden Throne, using it to hold back the dangers of the warp from breaking through into the Imperium in the Emperor's absence. The strain of doing so was incredible, and as the Emperor was carried to take his place back on the throne, Malkador's body began crumbling to dust. In his final moments, Malkador transferred his last remaining psychic energy to the Emperor, briefly restoring him to consciousness. With little time left, the Emperor delivered his final instructions to those gathered around him, urging them to continue the fight against chaos and the ignorance that still threatened humanity. His broken body was then entombed within the life-sustaining mechanisms of the Golden Throne, his spirit trapped between the physical world and the warp, where he would remain for the next 10,000 years. With the Webway project now impossible to complete, the Golden Throne now served two critical functions: keeping the Emperor's shattered body alive and allowing him to project his mind into the warp. There he maintains the Astronomicon, a powerful psychic beacon that allows Imperial ships to navigate across the galaxy while also fighting an endless battle against the Chaos Gods on their own turf, eternally working to protect humanity from their corruption. The Imperium survived the Horus Heresy, but without the Emperor's direct guidance, it gradually transformed into exactly the kind of repressive and brutal regime he had spent his life fighting against. In this, the Chaos Gods had won a partial victory. For an Imperium built on fear, ignorance, and oppression would always produce souls vulnerable to their temptations, ensuring that corruption would continue to fester within humanity and preventing the better future the Emperor had once envisioned. The Age of the Imperium is the term used by Imperial historians for the 10,000 years of human history that followed the end of the Horus Heresy, the period during which the Imperium of Man took the form it is recognizable as today. This vast span of time encompasses many distinct eras across its 10 millennia. The time of rebirth was the first era, following the Horus Heresy, lasting from roughly the end of the conflict until the middle of the 32nd millennium. During this period, the Imperium slowly began to recover from the devastation of the heresy, rebuilding economically, politically, and technologically. In a campaign known as the Great Scouring, the Imperial forces hunted the remaining traitors across human space, driving them from their strongholds. Eventually, the Chaos Space Marines and their allies were pushed into the massive permanent tear in the fabric of reality known as the Eye of Terror. Of note is that the surviving loyal Primarchs did not remain to guide the Imperium into its future following the Scouring. One by one, each was lost through different circumstances. Some supposedly died, some entered a form of suspended animation, and others vanished into the warp or other mysterious realms. The Imperium and the Space Marine legions each Primarch had led were left without their greatest champions, and the loss profoundly weakened both. With the traitor forces driven into the Eye of Terror, the Imperium enjoyed a period of relative peace from chaos. However, many alien species that had been defeated during the Great Crusade seized the opportunity presented by the Imperium's weakened state, re-emerging to threaten human worlds across the galaxy. The Forging, sometimes called the Golden Age of the Imperium, was an era lasting from roughly the middle of the 32nd millennium to the start of the 35th millennium. It was a time of consolidation and expansion beyond the borders established during the Great Crusade, and represented the high point of Imperial civilization in the aftermath of the heresy, culturally, politically, and technologically. During this period, the Imperial State Church, known as the Adeptus Ministorum, grew in political power as the worship of the Emperor as a god became a dominant feature of life across most human worlds. A direct contradiction of everything the Emperor himself had once stood for with his imperial truth, as it became the Imperial Cult. The Imperial Cult, officially known as the Cult Imperialis, is the sole state religion of the Imperium, devoted to the worship of the Emperor as humanity's divine savior. It is maintained and promoted by the Adeptus Ministorum, also commonly known as the Ecclesiarchy. The core beliefs of the Imperial Cult, beyond the deification of the Emperor, hold that all humans across the galaxy must eventually be brought under the Imperium's rule, that alien species are an inherent danger to humanity's rightful dominance of the galaxy and must be treated with absolute hostility, and that unsanctioned psychic powers and human mutation represent grave threats that must be controlled or eliminated entirely. The Nova Terra Interregnum, also called the Time of Twin Empires, was a period of over 900 years during the early 35th through early 36th millennium in which the Imperium fractured into warring factions. A governing council on the world of Nova Terra rejected the authority of the Imperium's ruling body on Earth and declared independent control over the western reaches of the galaxy. At the same time, the Adeptus Mechanicus was once again torn apart by internal religious conflict and civil war. Scattered records from this era make cryptic references to a catastrophic threat arising from a region of space known as the Ghoul Stars, called the Pale Wasting. Much of the evidence has been censored or destroyed, and what remains is contradictory, describing the threat as a plague that consumed scores of worlds and as mysterious nightmare engines that slaughtered the populations of entire sectors. A Space Marine chapter, known as the Nova Marines, participated in the campaign against it, yet their own records contain no mention of the conflict whatsoever. The threat was eventually dealt with, but a Space Marine chapter called the Death Spectres maintains a permanent vigil beyond the Imperium's borders to this day, ensuring that whatever lurks in the Ghoul Stars never threatens the galaxy again. After nearly 1,000 years of civil war and political instability, the Imperium was reunited in the 975th year of the 35th millennium through a series of events known as the Cataclysm of Souls. The Adeptus Ministorum attempted to seize total control of the Imperium and transform it into a theocracy, denouncing the rebellious Council as heretics defying the will of the Emperor. The resulting religious uprisings across the western reaches of the galaxy ultimately toppled this Council and restored the authority of the Imperium's ruling council over all territories. However, the Church emerged from the conflict dramatically more powerful than before, a development that would help set the stage for an even greater crisis in the following millennium, known as the Age of Apostasy. The Age of Apostasy, beginning in the early 36th millennium, grew in large part from a long-running power struggle between the Imperium's administrative bureaucracy and its state church, each seeking dominance over the Imperium's governance. Imperial historians divide the period into two major events, the Reign of Blood and the Plague of Unbelief. The crisis began when a single man, Goj Vandir, seized effective control of the entire Imperium. Holding the positions of both head of the imperial bureaucracy and leader of the state church simultaneously, he ruled according to his own desires rather than the emperor's will, ushering in a period of brutal tyranny. His reign was ultimately brought down by a reforming preacher named Sebastian Thor, who led a religious movement called the Confederation of Light. Drawing on teachings that had previously been banned by the dominant faction of the imperial faith, the Confederation sought to end Vandir's corruption of imperial religion and restore it to what its followers believed was a more moral form, one that truly reflected the spirit of the Emperor's own sacrifice for humanity. Vandir held power for nearly a century before being overthrown during a crusade launched against him, and was ultimately killed by his own bodyguards, a warrior sisterhood known as the Daughters of the Emperor, who would later become the Adepta Sororitas. Sebastian Thor took his place as head of the Imperial Church and initiated the Imperium's second great era of reform since the Horus Heresy. The end of the Reign of Blood brought sweeping changes to the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy underwent a major reformation. A new branch of the Inquisition, called the Ordo Hereticus, was established to root out enemies of the Emperor operating from within the Imperium's own institutions, and the Adepta Sororitas became both the ecclesiarchy's military arm and the fighting force of the Ordo Hereticus. Throughout the chaos of the Age of Apostasy, numerous false prophets emerged, some little more than madmen at the head of rebel armies, others commanding entire worlds and vast military forces. The most powerful of these was a renegade church official, known as the apostate Cardinal Bucarus of Gathalamor, whose heresy and rebellion grew so vast and destructive that it became known as the Plague of Unbelief. This Age of Apostasy stands as one of the bloodiest periods in imperial history, second only to the Horus Heresy itself. The Age of Redemption followed the Age of Apostasy and was defined by a wave of intense religious fervor sweeping across the Imperium. Driven by this renewed devotion, the Imperium launched countless crusades and military campaigns against those considered enemies of the Emperor, channeling the trauma of the preceding era into outward aggression and religious zeal. The Age of Redemption drew to a close in the early 38th millennium as the Imperium came under mounting pressure from chaos and alien enemies, its power beginning to erode. This marked the beginning of a long era of gradual decline and stagnation known as the Waning. The Waning lasted from the early 38th millennium until the early 41st millennium. With the Imperium's military forces exhausted by the relentless crusades of the preceding era, worlds fell one after another to orc invasions, chaos uprisings, alien infestations, and outright rebellion. The period ended with the onset of the greatest crisis the Imperium had faced since the Horus Heresy, an era known as the Time of Ending. The Time of Ending lasted from 4744 to roughly 4999 AD, and was defined by an escalating series of existential threats to the Imperium. New and terrifying alien species, including the Tau, the ancient and deathly Necrons, and the Tyranids, a vast alien swarm consuming everything in their path, either awakened or appeared in the galaxy for the first time. Simultaneously, the power of chaos grew dramatically, its corruption spreading into every corner of the Imperium. The era came to a catastrophic close when Abaddon the Despoiler, the supreme commander of the Chaos Space Marines and the greatest champion of chaos, launched his 13th Black Crusade and achieved a devastating victory. The heavily fortified world of Cadia, which had stood for millennia as the primary barrier between the Eye of Terra and the rest of the galaxy, fell. This was followed by the eruption of a massive galaxy-spanning Terran reality known as the Great Rift, splitting the Imperium in two. The era that followed is known as the Era Indomitus. The Era Indomitus, also called the Age of the Dark Imperium, is the current period of Imperial history in the 41st millennium. It is defined, above all, by the Great Rift, the massive Terran reality that has physically split the Imperium into two isolated halves, an event which brought about the Blackness. Also called Noctis Aeterna or the Days of Blinding, it was triggered by two connected disasters: the fall of the fortress world of Cadia to the forces of chaos, and the subsequent tearing open of the Great Rift. This rupture disrupted two of the Imperium's most critical lifelines: the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows ships to navigate faster than light travel, and astropathic communication, the method by which humanity's worlds send messages across interstellar distances. Without these, worlds became effectively cut off from one another. How long the darkness lasted depended heavily on where one was. On Terra, humanity's capital, it endured just 33 days. Elsewhere, it could stretch for decades or even centuries, partly because the Great Rift's distortion of the warp caused time itself to flow unevenly across the galaxy. Eventually, the worst effects faded, communications were slowly restored, and in response, the Imperium launched a massive military campaign, the Indomitus Crusade, to reclaim lost ground. The half of the galaxy on humanity's side of the Great Rift was gradually brought back under control. Sadly, the other half remained largely dark and unreachable. The Imperium during the Era Indomitus was shaped profoundly by the resurrection of the Primarch Rabute Guilliman, who returned to take up the role of Lord Commander and Regent of the Imperium. Together with a senior Adeptus Mechanicus figure named Belisarius Cawl, Guilliman initiated the Ultima Founding, leading to the creation of a new breed of even more advanced Space Marines known as Primaris Space Marines, who represented a significant step beyond the original Astartes template. Armed with these new warriors, Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade, sending fleets across the galaxy to defend the Imperium wherever possible against the tide of chaos and alien threats pushing humanity toward extinction. Our final note on the present era of the Imperium is that Guilliman is not the only Primarch to have returned during this era. Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, sometime in the early 42nd millennium during the Arcs of Omen crisis, was also brought back into the fray of Imperium history. Unlike his brother Primarch Guilliman, who excels at leadership and administration and has taken on the role of rebuilding and governing the Imperium, Lionel Johnson is at his core a warrior, a hunter and killer above all else. Having recently awakened to find the galaxy consumed by darkness and war, he now moves across the stars driven by a mission of vengeance. And that, my friends, is the Warhammer 40,000 timeline. If you liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm looking forward to the next video with all of you.